Hey everybody, welcome back to the Brave and the Boys. I'm your host Jake, and today we have me running the camera, which I know is a big shock, so there's no Jordan today, no Jess, but I do have a handy dandy app on my watch that lets me record, so let's see how today goes. Be kind today. Today we are doing the world famous Bunkmaster 5 comic book challenge. So for those of you that don't know, the 5 comic book challenge is you have to pick the 5 graphic novels, comic books, floppies, omnibuses, any format really, the 5 comic books that mean the absolute most to you and talk about why. When I first watched it, I really loved his video, which I'm gonna link here. It was really easy to narrow down 8 to 10 books that were the most important to me. Going back and forth, pros and cons list. At one point I called Jordan, a lot of shouting down the stairs to Jess about what each book meant to me. I feel great about my choices. The thing I love most about comic books is they've been there for me in every stage of my life, so I tried to pick a mixture of books from different stages of my life. I'm very excited. Comic books mean the world to me. They're my favorite medium. So before we dive into my 5 most important comic books, I gotta give a shout out to our sponsor, Organic Price Books. You can save $2 on your order with the code Braveboys, or if you're shipping 3 or more books together, you can use the code Braveboyssit to save 5% on your order. We also have a Redbubble, which is linked down below in the description, so you can get a mug or a shirt. I mean, we're up to 1 t-shirt and 3 mugs sold, so at this point, I'm basically an empire. Okay, now that all the boring stuff is out of the way, let's dive into my 5 most important comic books.
Deep within a bleak and dismal swamp, hidden beneath its murky waters, lies the headquarters of the most sinister villains of all time, the Legion of Doom.
Calvin and Hobbes was a comic strip started by Bill Watterson in 1985, and it had a profound impact on me. I was reading Calvin and Hobbes since before I could read. It was my first comic anything. It was donated to me by my older cousins when they aged out of it, though how you can age out of Calvin and Hobbes, I don't know. And it has a deep impact on me. As I grew older, my love for Calvin and Hobbes never waned. It's one of those comic strips that you think is written for kids, but when you read it when you're an adult, you're like, oh my God, how is it like spitting deep philosophical truths? I mean, it has quotes that I try to live my life by, like, there's never enough time to do all the nothing that you want. Calvin and Hobbes means the world to me. It made me fall in love with picture books, and it taught me how to read. So if there was no Calvin and Hobbes, there'd be no Brave and the Boys channel, because I never would have gotten into comic books. So I'm very grateful that I got all those secondhand Calvin and Hobbes. I mean, I loved those paperback Calvin and Hobbes so much. Me, a hardcover aficionado, decided to buy the Calvin and Hobbes paperback because I wanted it to be nostalgic, like how I read them growing up. Calvin and Hobbes, I can't speak to how much I love it enough. I understand how protective Bill Watterson is over his property. I understand that there'll never be a movie or a TV show. There'll never even be a Hobbes stuffed animal. And I respect it. So I do go back to these books often. Whenever I kind of just need to recap that childhood innocence or joy, I'll pop open a random one. Now, I don't know the rules of the 5 comic challenge. I don't know if I was supposed to pick one comic strip, so maybe this is cheating off the bat. You'll see a lot of that in this list. But Calvin and Hobbes will definitely be the first and #1 spot on my most important comics. So Calvin and Hobbes was the first comic strip that I ever fell in love with, but Final Crisis, the trade paperback, not the omnibus, was the first DC book I ever received. And I had grown up watching the Super Friends because my family's only cable channel was Boomerang, so for me, I thought the Super Friends were brand new. And then from there, I transitioned to Justice League, Batman the Animated Series, Justice League Unlimited, Superman the Animated Series, and I loved all of them. Though I had never really read comic books. Comics were a little less accessible for me growing up just because my parents didn't read comic books, no one in my family did, so I really had no one to kind of teach me the way. But I was going to church camp when I was about 13, and before we went, I remember being in a bookstore, and whenever I went to go to a bookstore, I would go down the graphic novel aisle and just flip through them, but I never really picked any up. But this time I was like, hey mom, can I get this book, and take it with me to church camp? And I picked what is probably the worst book to ever start reading. I mean, if I could think of the worst book for a new comic book reader to start with, Final Crisis would probably be #1. The endearing thing is though, I didn't know enough to know what I didn't know enough to read this book. So I took it at face value. I didn't realize that this was like the 4th Crisis, and I should have read like 20 years of books. Final Crisis was written by Grant Morrison, and it is a confusing book and probably shouldn't have been my first book. However, it worked. I fell in love. I mean, the story was crazy. Gods getting murdered, Batman wielding a gun, something he said he would never do, Superman killing a reality vampire through the power of song. I mean, this book is insane, and it created a deep hunger for me. After this book, I searched out and I found a friend who knew more about comic books, and I told him I read Final Crisis, and he kind of chuckled. He said, well, there's a few you should have read first. And I was like, oh, I'll read them now. I went backwards. So I went Final Crisis, 52, then Infinite Crisis. If you go to our DC reading order video, which is right here, you'll see that is not the order that you should go in, but it worked. I fell in love, and DC has been something I've been a fan of my entire life. My love of DC helped me build this channel, and I've met so many friends through the Near Mint Discord and through other, Reddit groups and stuff, and it means the world to me, and I'm not sure if any of this would be here if I hadn't made the fateful choice to pick this up. I love DC Comics with all my heart. They mean the absolute world to me. I'll never forget the feeling I had when I went up down that graphic novel and I pulled out the cover and it was Superman holding a dead Batman. I mean, how could you not pick that book? Final Crisis is crazy, outlandish, wacky, wild. You need to read like 17 books to even understand it, but I didn't. I fell in love with it from the first time I read it. I read it twice in one sitting. It was amazing, and that is why I'm very happy, and it was a no-brainer to be number 2 on my list of the most important comic books. For those of you that have watched previous videos of mine, you've probably heard me talk about how New Frontier is my all-time favorite DC story. To me, it is timeless. It perfectly encapsulates everything that I love about DC Comics. The feeling I got when I was a child watching Justice League Unlimited and seeing these amazing heroes do amazing things. Everything that makes me feel good about reading a comic book, this does. It was written and illustrated by Darwin Cook. Absolute New Frontier is my all-time favorite DC story. It means the complete world to me, and I probably read it about once a year. If someone wants to know what makes DC's characters so special, I don't think there's another book that sums it up. And to own it in a format like this, it is my favorite absolute. The art looks incredible. It has the amazing slipcase. I mean, for those of you that don't know, absolutes are my favorite way to collect stories, and if I could only have one absolute in the whole world, it would be Absolute New Frontier. Everyone should pick this up. I can't sing the praises of this book higher. I literally don't think there's anything wrong with it. It is incredible. Every DC character gets an amazing moment to shine. I love that the villain is unique, and I love that it kind of harkens back to the Silver Age of comics, and because of that, it feels timeless. Sometimes something is so vintage, it's evergreen and timeless, and I think New Frontier is. There's just no other book in my collection that makes me feel as good as when I read this book. So for that reason, it had to be number 3 on my list of most important comic books. The hardest part about this challenge for me, for picking the 5 most important books, was not just choosing all the books I got signed by Tom King.
All right. I like
Hello.
your t-shirt, dude.
Oh, thank you. It's an honor to meet you, man. I'm Jake. You're one of my favorite comic book writers.
Am I on video right now? Hello, everybody on the video.
Thank you.
Where are you streaming this?
Oh, this is just for recording, but we have a comic book podcast called The Brave and the Boys. But we just recently did an interview with Sal from Comic Pop. Well, I know he's interviewed you.
Sal, he's so nice. He's the best.
And my crown of joy is you've called me a nerd on Twitter 3 times.
I'm sure a 4th is coming soon. We'll be nerded out.
For sure. Super Friends kind of point of view of everything.
I think you're really gonna like Brave.
Thank you so much.
It was super hard. I imposed the rule on myself. I could only include 1 book I got signed by Tom King that day. However, it still wasn't that hard. Superman Up in the Sky is my favorite Superman story. Everything I love about New Frontier and what that does for the entire DC universe, I think this book does for Superman. This book means so many things to me. One of my early videos on the channel that we did with Jordan is I bought a couple copies of Superman Up in the Sky and I gave them out to friends. But what I love is Superman is my favorite character in comics. And I think a lot of people who don't understand comics might think Superman is boring, or they see the Zack Snyder movies and think Superman is dour or serious. This book takes Superman off-world trying to rescue a young girl named Alice. And each story is almost standalone, and it tests Superman in some way. Challenges like having to outsmart a supercomputer made of Zeta beams, boxing an unbeatable foe, even a psychological war against himself. And along the way, you just see Superman rise to the occasion, and he's just so special. But on a more deeper level, I love this book because it represents the first time I took Jess to a comic convention, and I got to really open up and share my love of comics with her. I got to meet Tom King, who is my absolute favorite writer, and he got to autograph it, and it just, means so much to me. Everyone should read it. So it had to be the next one on my list for the most important comics ever. Like I said, this was a hard list for me to make. One of the hardest parts was trying to narrow down a ongoing series that I collected in single issues that meant the world to me. I went back and forth on what I was going to include. I almost went to my parents' house to pick up my comic book collection so I'd have the individual issues, but I decided I was going to cheat again. So DC Rebirth meant the world to me. If you guys just watched my last video, which will be right here, you'll see me talk about DC Rebirth. But what I loved about it was how they marketed it as the next entry point, as good as the New 52, to jump into comics. So when the New 52 came out, I was still in high school. I couldn't afford comic books. But when DC Rebirth came out, I was an adult with adult money. So I remember going into a comic book shop for the very first time to buy the new copy of DC Rebirth, and it was incredible. It was an amazing experience. What sprung off from there was my Batman ongoing series written by Tom King, my Action Comics, my Superman, and my Detective Comics. So those, I basically collected everything Rebirth, but those four, I mean, the Flash run by Joshua Williamson, I collected all of that. So this sprung into all of my ongoing collections. It was a special time in my life of every Wednesday going to the comic book store, and then I would get a coffee afterwards and I would read the new comics in a comic book shop. None of that would have happened if I hadn't read DC Rebirth. It reignited this love that I've had as a child, something that I'd always wanted to do, which was collect comic books, and became my jumping on point. And it meant the absolute world to me. And it was so cool because they would have little tidbits of this overarching, you know, Doomsday Clock storyline. I mean, even this led into Doomsday Clock. I remember how much me and Jordan loved that. I remember when the final Doomsday Clock issue finally came out, me and Jordan had made plans to hang out that day. We were going to Six Flags, so we went to the comic book shop first and we made one of our girlfriends drive, and we just read Doomsday Clock together in the car. And I remember I finished it first and I was just like, oh my God, you're not gonna believe the ending. And it was an incredible experience. All of that came from DC Rebirth. It was a very special time in my life, and for that reason, it had to be number 5 on my list of the most important comics. Now, I don't know if this is in the spirit of the 5 comic book challenge, but I did want to throw in one honorable mention. This was super close to making the list. My favorite comic book character of all time is Dick Grayson, aka Robin, aka Nightwing. I love it so much, and this is the best run ever I've ever read on Nightwing. It means the world to me. The reason I'm throwing it in as an honorable mention is I want to introduce you guys to the newest member of the Spencer family. So I want you guys to meet little Dick Grayson, little Nightwing. We just picked him up yesterday. He is 8 weeks old, and I gotta name him after my favorite superhero because my girlfriend is awesome. So while Nightwing Leaping into the Light isn't my most important one yet, it is my favorite ongoing series, and every time I read it, it means the world to me. And I get to use it as a segue to introduce you to my special little guy. Vader is doing so good as an older brother. I think today was the first time it hit him that, hey, this isn't a toy that I get to play with forever. It is a forever thing. And now he's just kind of being a little moody, but he's been such a good brother. For all those of you that don't follow Vader and Grayson on Instagram, I'll have it linked in the description down below, but I love my cats, guys. Let's jump into my actual conclusions. And there you have it, folks. I conquered the 5 comic challenge. This was a lot of fun. It was really cool going down memory lane and getting to remember how much these books mean to me. As soon as I'm done, I'm gonna read some Calvin and Hobbes before I edit. I love it so much. I wanna thank you all for watching. I wanna thank Bunkmaster B for challenging me. If you guys wanna find his channel, it'll be linked right up here. And I guess it's my turn to challenge someone. I'm gonna challenge OmniDog to this video. So OmniDog from OmniDog's Vault, you can check him out over here. I challenge you to the 5 comic book challenge. And I challenge Jordan, my co-host, to be the next person to do the 5 comic book challenge. I'd love to hear what your 5 favorite comics are, so tell me in the comments down below. Make this video yourself and tag me. I want to thank you all so much for watching. Smash that like button. Guys, keep watching and stay brave.